Hello. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Full Press Fantasy Live. Here we are Sunday morning, October 30th, day before Halloween. The Packers have a scary matchup today, but yes, some potentially scary injuries over the last week for certain players. And don't be afraid, though. We're here to help out, give updated active and inactive reports later. I know there's a few players in the later games that are questionable entering, and so I'll talk about how I'm kind of navigating a few instances where what players I've got as backup options to these players that if they are active, we'd like to start them, but we're not sure. And so I think it's important. One quick example: Brandon Cooks. He's questionable at a 4:20 p.m. Eastern game. So, if all your all the other options at wide receiver, for instance, are playing 1 o'clock, and you have to kind of decide now. That's maybe less than ideal. You maybe want to go look to see if is there someone available on the waiver wire as a free agent who is playing at 4 p.m. or later, playing Sunday night or Monday night, as long as it's late enough to be able to replace for a guy, for instance, Brandon Cooks, right? Like he's a good enough player. We expect him to get enough targets to where, and I think we like the matchup enough as well that if he's active, we'd like to play him. But again, we need to have other options because we definitely don't want to take a zero. And if that's all you can do, then you have to kind of make that decision for 1 o'clock. But anyway, so I'll talk about how to navigate that. I'll also talk about some start-sit decisions, and I'll talk about some of the decisions I'm making personally, and also why I'm making them. But of course, feel free to also in the comments on the Full Press Coverage YouTube page to ask. By the way, I guess I should introduce myself for those who aren't familiar with the show. I'm Kyle Senra at Senra Says on Twitter. I co-host the Full Press Coverage Packers pod. As you can tell, I'm clearly a Packers fan, but also the Full Press Fantasy podcast. And I know that every week my co-host Brad Harvin and I, he's on Twitter at @therundown_BH. And he and I, each week we debate our rankings for fantasy football, and we'll talk other different fantasy topics, whether it's trades or this week was obviously injuries. How do we deal with those injuries? So we'll usually do a rankings debate, but also kind of a general fantasy topic of the week that feel needs to be addressed kind of going into every week. Earlier in the season was, how do you approach waiver wires, for instance? And so, yeah, we'll kind of just every week on the Full Press Fantasy Pod on Twitter at FPC_fantasy pod. But yeah, I guess what we should do is get into these start-sit decisions. So for anyone who's been watching the last couple of weeks, you'll know what I do is I've got a spreadsheet that I create for all of my start-sit decisions. And so what I'll do is I'll just give me a minute here and I'll share that and kind of show not only what decisions I'm making, but why am I making certain decisions? Like what factors are leading to that? And yeah, so we'll just get started here. Again, allow me to share everything and we'll get going. I guess before we really get started, I should also mention if you do want to make any bets or any prop picks and you want to win money, you can go to my bookie and using the promo code PRESS22 for Full Press Coverage. That's all caps PRESS and the numbers 22. You get a double deposit match. So whatever you put in, they will match that and double your funds. So up to $1,000. So you put in $1,000, they'll give you another free $1,000 on top of that if you use the promo code PRESS22. So again, that's at my bookie. And again, if you want to make any game picks, over-unders, or prop picks, that's all available for you to go and win as many contests as you can. All right, so yeah, as I mentioned, I'll get started on start-sit decisions. So what I have here is a spreadsheet here. I'll zoom out entirely. I'll go to 100%. I've got all the players that I'm kind of deciding for in each league I'm in, but then also what are each factor that I kind of am looking at. So the first column is obviously what opponent the team is playing, helps me kind of look at things more easily. And then from there, the first three columns are always production based. What is the average fantasy points a player has produced? And then also what's their floor and ceiling this year? What have they produced? What's their range of outcomes? Next, I get this data from Football Outsiders. The first three columns you can get on whatever platform you're on. I think every fantasy platform I ever played on, your player has a player card, player ID, whatever it is, and it shows you their game log. And so you could see, you should be able to see stats of their total fantasy points, but you can also see each game individually. And so that's where I get that from. because that is taking into account the scoring settings for your particular league. I think that's better than anything general. So look for your league scoring settings for those. From Football Outsiders, I get the offensive line rankings and the defensive DVOA for the matchup. And also, speaking of matchup, certain fantasy sites will also show the defense rank in points allowed per position. So I include that when possible. And then finally, the odds makers implied team total for the team, but then also the game total for the game overall. And then lastly, if you go to Full Press Coverage, I've got a weekly article called the Goal Line Guide. And what I do there is I just try to determine likelihood of touchdowns, both rushing and passing for each team. And it takes into account the matchups. It does take into account the implied team total. So it does kind of feed into your double. And what I've actually changed this week is also the difference that each team has between their rushing and passing scores. And I think what really influenced that, kind of woke me up last week, was the Dallas Cowboys had the second highest passing goal line grade score, but they also had the sixth highest rushing score. And what happened against the Lions is they just were so good at running that they didn't actually need to throw the ball. So when they were getting close to the goal line, they would just run every time. So even though they had a great, in fact, it was the second best score overall, passing grade, they didn't throw enough to take advantage of that. So, the difference would have been minimal. This week, the Cowboys' difference is a little better. The Bears' run defense seems to be better than at least what the Lions have. I think everyone's run defense is better than the Lions. Again, Packers fan, I love ripping on the Lions, but their defense is pretty awful. And so anyway, so I have not only the grade, but then also in parentheses the difference is the positive for like for instance, we start off with three quarterbacks here, so the difference in grade will be for passing scores. So, for instance, Washington's goal line passing grade is 14.5, above their rushing score, whereas for PJ Walker and Tannehill's not playing, so that one you almost don't need to take into account. But say for PJ Walker, their running score is so much higher, and their passing grade ends up minus 57 difference. So taking not just the grade but also the difference, because a team could have a high grade in one area, but if they have a high grade in the other area, they might be just as likely to score. So again, this is all to determine the likelihood of touchdowns. But those are all the factors I kind of look into to decide who am I picking. And so if we want to just look real quick at some of the decisions I'm making. So yeah, I mentioned that as a QB2 this week, certainly with Tannehill out, decided between Taylor Heineke and PJ Walker. Honestly, with Tannehill healthy, I might have still gone Taylor Heineke anyway, but a lot of the numbers kind of point to that. Now, the tricky thing here is that Heineke's literally played one game. And I mean, PJ Walker's played two, so the sample size is small. Now, Heineke, his floor and ceiling is the same as his average because that's the one game he's played, but that looks pretty good so far. The one thing with PJ Walker is we've seen his first start, he had 2.45 fantasy points. Now, last week was a lot better, almost got to 20, and it kind of, if he and Heineke can kind of produce that, it should be no difference. I guess there's a lot of things about the matchup. I mentioned the goal line grade is certainly one where I could see that the Panthers really running the ball a lot against the Falcons defense. And so not as many opportunities to score passing touchdowns for PJ Walker. Whereas I don't know that Washington will be able to run as easily against the Colts defense. And so the goal line grade is another factor there. Cause really all of the game factors in terms of, I mean, it's not really great in terms of, 41.5 over under combined for the Falcons Panthers. That's not really screaming shootout. So all the areas where Walker would win, I guess the one major one is the defensive DVOA. Atlanta's defense not very good because with DVOA, the way Football Outsiders does it, a positive score is this team allows above average production per play to opposing offenses, and below average, and a negative score is below average. And so while both teams are above average, significantly higher for the Falcons defense than it is for the Colts defense, which makes it the kind of the better matchup overall, not looking specifically at quarterbacks. Now, if you look at, the position rankings, and the way position rankings work is the rank for the defense. So a higher score means a better defense, which means a worse matchup. So, I mean, it's a close 13th and 15th. It almost really shouldn't count, but essentially meaning both middle of the pack in terms of points allowed. It's just the Falcons defense overall as a passing defense is just much worse. So it would technically mean Walker has the better matchup, but if you look at all the goal line grade and the production, it leans towards Heineke. So that's why I'm making that decision. In that same league, I also decided a flex spot between KJ Osborne, Ben Skoranek, and Khalif Raymond. And I've gone with KJ Osborne. This one was close. I guess part of it is production. I mean, he's so far shown the highest ceiling, 19.55 as opposed to 18.1 for Skoranek, 16.05 for Raymond. So in the right circumstance, which I mean, this game is a 48.5 over under, so this seems like it might be the right circumstance. Although technically the Lions Dolphins game is higher, but where that mitigates is the fact that the Vikings have the higher implied total. So one extra thing towards Osborne. The only thing that's really working for Skoranek is his floor. He scored at least 4 points every game this year. But from a last guy, last flex guy, I really am chasing ceiling. So better average technically for Skoranek over Osborne. And I think with Raymond is the production has been there, but we also expect him to maybe get more opportunity this week, but we also are guessing there. But there's a lot of categories where Skoranek is last. The offensive line is the worst. The DVOA matchup is technically average against the 49ers, which is crazy. You'd think the 49ers, I think their run defense DVOA, that's in the negatives to where it's a really tough matchup. But even so, it's just above average, whereas the other two are significantly higher. Osborne and Raymond, their matchups against the Cardinals and Dolphins, respectively. And then, the Rams implied total, but also that game total are really low. Not the type of game scripts you'd want for a receiver. You want the high total game scripts. Now, the Rams have the highest goal line grade of the three teams anyway, between the Vikings and the Lions. But the difference isn't as big as it is for the Lions. Their run grade goal line, their rushing goal line grade, is I guess it'd be a 58.25, which is below average. So the passing offense seems like it'd be better anyway. So all of them have decent goal line grades, and all of them are the team's passing grade is higher than their team's rushing grade. It's just to varying degrees. So that one I didn't really even. Normally I put green for the highest in the category, orange for the lowest, to kind of just see the difference. When there's not much of a difference, I don't necessarily put much, and so. Even here, I really should take this out because there's not much difference between Heineke and Walker's matchup. But anyway, so all to say, I'm going with Osborne right now, and we'll have to see how that goes. I think there is temptation to play Skoranek, but I'm also already playing Tyler Higbee in the lineup, and so putting two Rams players, especially in this game, doesn't seem like it's a great idea. So I still may put actually Khalif Raymond, but for now, KJ Osborne's the guy in the lineup. Now, Khalif Raymond, funny enough, talk about another matchup with him. Decide between him, Khalif Raymond, Donovan Peoples-Jones, and Traquan Smith. Right now, I am leaning towards Smith. I haven't put Raymond in orange yet, so I haven't fully decided. It is really close. Production-wise, Smith's had the better average, basically equal average to Donovan Peoples-Jones. Although I think I kind of messed with this average, and he had a game with 0, but he also barely played. Like, he barely ran routes. It seemed like an outlier game for Donovan Peoples-Jones in terms of the number of snaps he played. So I don't think I took that. I took that game out to calculate this average. So if I was include that 0 game that Donovan Peoples-Jones had where he barely played, his average would be lower than Traquan Smith. So all to say that Smith's had the production, best ceiling game and best floor so far in games he's played. Now the offensive line does favor the Lions, so Raymond does kind of get a boost there. But neither offensive line for the Browns or the Saints are poor. They're above average technically. DVOA, the Saints have the best DVOA matchup against the Raiders, and the Browns have the worst against the Bengals here of these three, and it's significantly worse. And again, the Lions actually have a decent one. Against the Dolphins. So there would be potential consideration there for Raymond. But yeah, there's a lot of categories where Jones is the last. The implied total for the Browns, the overall over-under game total, Bengals, Browns, as well as the lowest. I might actually have that one wrong. I'll have to look that later because I feel like that's crazy that one's that low, 45.5. I'll have to check to make sure that's correct. But I think, because I was thinking it might have been closer to 48, I think it would still be the lowest no matter what. They have the lowest goal line grade, and compared to the Lions and Saints, their rushing goal line grade is better than their passing grade. So there's a lot of categories where Donovan Peoples-Jones was last. So he was kind of the easy one to say, no, I'm not going to start him. And then from there, it does just become, Khalif Raymond to Traquan Smith. And I've talked about that before. If you've got, I've got one spot, 3 players, try and see A is there one that stands out as, yes, this is the must-start player. And if that's not the case, is there one that stands out as being last, and you can eliminate them and then make it a 1-to-1 decision. Am I playing Khalif Raymond or Traquan Smith? Simplify the decision to make it easier. Now, if I were to do that, I'd see that in all the production metrics, Smith's higher than Raymond. the ceiling is close, and I suppose the floor at 1.5 isn't much of a floor, but all to say the average fantasy points is that's probably the most significant difference. Raymond's average has been 4.72 in this scoring setting, because as you see, Raymond in this different league, this scoring setting is 5.74. I think there's a 1.25 points per reception for wide receivers. That's where that comes into effect. But that's why I always say use the league scoring setting, because it might differ from, the same player might differ in two different leagues in terms of what they have. But anyway, so Traquan Smith, he gets the win in all three production metrics. Now, Raymond gets a +1 for the offensive line, but that's kind of mitigated by the DVOA. Both have the same implied total. Now, Raymond has the better game total, but then you look at the goal line grade, the overall grade is better for the Saints, but the difference between the rushing and passing grade is actually better for the Lions. So maybe that kind of mitigates it. So basically what we have is everything kind of cancels each other out. You've got the 3 wins here for Smith versus only 1 win in the game total for Raymond, and which we like for receivers, right? High game total over under. I think might be the only game that went above 50 this week. I can't remember if the Seahawks Giants might also have gone over 50, but it's definitely up there. But anyway, so looking at that one-on-one, though, it does kind of lean towards Traquan Smith, and that's why I've kind of made him the selection. I could keep going with a few others. Traquan Smith versus Hunter Renfrow. It's interesting because I know Adams was questionable. We'll get to that in a sec if he's in or not, but Adams being out might be enough. I don't love the matchup though against the Saints anyway, so I prefer the Saints matchup against the Raiders. It's funny that they are in the same game. And even though the Raiders are favored, and that would be one factor that you prefer Renfrow, I think a lot of other factors kind of say like the defensive DVOA, even the offensive line technically, even though it's close, kind of lead towards Traquan Smith. The other one in this league, in the Scott Fishbowl, it's tricky, is David Montgomery or Jamal Williams. And I've got a couple of decisions where I'm going to go with Jamal Williams, even with DeAndre Swift back. What they showed the first weeks when DeAndre Swift was playing is that Williams would still get goal line carries and has some high touchdown upside. Now, the goal line grade isn't great for the Lions, so there may not be much touchdown upside, but especially compared to David Montgomery, it's still a higher grade than what the Bears have. Averages, the floor is basically about the same between Montgomery and Williams. They both seem like they're, I would say 50-50 splits to varying degrees, and they almost have the different roles, because it does seem like David Montgomery, although last week he didn't catch any passes, normally has been the pass catching back, whereas Williams has been kind of the short yardage guy, and they'll give the passing downs to Swift. But it's funny that their floors end up being the same, just a much significantly higher ceiling for Williams. His best game is 26.2 this year. That was a 2-touchdown game, to be fair, but still, that he's shown he's capable of putting that. Montgomery hasn't hit 20 points yet, and that reflects in the average. Again, better offensive line. Well, the Bears' offensive line, not horrible from a run perspective. They're the worst in the league from a pass protection point of view. So you've already got basically, we'll call the floor even, but that's 3 edges for Williams. Now, the DVOA is worse, so they're both pretty bad. They're both below average, but worse for Williams than, say, the Dolphins. So you technically give the edge there to Montgomery. You've got the defensive rankings, which is funny that the run defense DVOA for the Dolphins is so poor, yet they've allowed the 15th fewest fantasy points. So I guess that's the 17th most. So, compared to the Cowboys, who they've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs. And then the game total, this really should be in green here. The over/under for the game as well, but the implied total for the Lions as well, the over/under game total for both teams really does lean to most categories. Williams is beating Montgomery. Again, the only one was the DVOA matchup, and it's you could say that because the Bears' passing goal line grade is so poor, they actually have a positive difference for the run game, but the overall grade is still lower than the Lions, so it's tough to give them an edge there. But the 2 spots where Montgomery has an edge over Williams aren't really significant enough, so I'd prefer Williams over Montgomery straight up. So I've got him higher in my rankings. Jamal Williams over Curtis Samuel and Robert Woods, and that seemed also pretty easy. He kind of had the edge. You could see a lot of the green over them in a lot of different categories. The Washington goal line grade was maybe the one spot Curtis Samuel had an edge, and then the defensive DVOA against the Texans was the one spot Wood had an edge, but in every other category, Williams was the better play. Finally, I'll end with these two, just quick one-to-one decisions. Noah Fant versus Devontae Parker. There is tight end premium scoring in this league. I'm going for 2 writers league. And so what you'll see is the only two spots where Devontae Parker has an edge is his ceiling. He had a game where he hit 26 fantasy points, and that's the one thing with Fant is there's not much ceiling here. He hasn't even hit 12 fantasy points. But a safer floor, and because of it, a better average, because Parker's hit 0 twice, I think. The other spot where Parker has a slight edge is offensive line ranking. That's still like the bottom third of the league, though. 20th ranked offensive line versus the 25th. So a slight edge to Parker, but it's not that great. But every other category, Fant has an edge over Parker because it's tight end premium. It was a flex spot, so I'm going Fant over Devontae Parker. And then finally, Braxton Berrios over Olamide Zaccheaus. It's a flex spot. I mean, it is two wide receivers. Picked up Berrios, but the injury to Breece Hall, I did wonder how much they might use him to help the run game. There's really only two spots where Berrios gets an edge. One is as a passer, the goal line grade. The Jets have the second highest score this week. Their passing game goal line grade compared to their rushing game goal line grade is the highest difference of any team. A big factor on that is the Patriots have not allowed a single rushing touchdown inside their own 5-yard line. And especially no Breece Hall, I don't think it gets any easier for the Jets. So once they get inside the goal line, as much as we don't necessarily have much faith in Zach Wilson, I mean, Michael Carter, to be fair, has also gotten some goal line touchdowns, and there's James Robinson there. They may still run the ball, but I don't know if they'll be necessarily that effective at it. The numbers say it would be better to pass there against the Patriots, but again, maybe Zach Wilson, that's not the identity of the Jets. Either way, that's the one spot where Braxton Berrios has an edge. The other one is offensive line. Their offensive line is 18th in pass protection. The Falcons is 31st. Yeah, they've allowed the sack rate is the second worst in the league. They're only worse than the Bears. They're actually worse than Washington and worse than the Bengals. So, but that's not enough. Every other metric, all the production metrics, the average, the floor, certainly. Zaccheaus hasn't scored in this league scoring setting anyway, less than 7.6 fantasy points in a game. And that's enough of a difference to where, I mean, the ceiling's not great, but all the other numbers point towards Zaccheaus. So anyway, that's my reasoning for those players. And I guess we're past 11:45. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go check to see. Before I get to the inactives from this game, I do want to touch on some players from the later games. Sorry. So I mentioned Brandon Cooks earlier, so that's a good place to start with. So so I've got Brandon Cooks in a league where I do want to start him, and because it's a 4:25 Eastern game, you may not have every single player available to there might be some players that play at 1 o'clock, and if you want to replace him with Cook, you have to make that decision first before knowing if Cooks plays or not. It's probably a player you'd prefer to sit over Cooks, and so because of that, you don't want to necessarily play them right away without knowing about Cooks. So I guess for me, it was key to look at players that you can replace with Brandon Cooks that are either playing at that time or playing later. Now, the first thing you do is if a player's out, who's replacing them on their team? Now, Nico Collins, the wide receiver 2 for the Texans, he's already been ruled out. So if Cooks doesn't play, you've got, I guess, Chris Moore, Tyler Johnson. It maybe means more for the tight ends, Jordan Akins, Brevin Jordan, OJ Howard. Here, I'm going to pull up the Texans depth chart real quick. I don't love many of the options. I would imagine Chris Moore is probably the only one that is maybe worthy of being starting. Philip Dorsett, Jalen Camp. Those would be, if Brandon Cook's out, they'll have 4 receivers active. Chris Moore, Philip Dorsett, Tyler Johnson, Jalen Camp. Again, Moore is currently listed as a starter alongside Collins and Cooks. So he to me speaks like he'll be the number 1 receiver. And then from there, I don't really want to even play Chris Moore, but he to me seems the only one who would be playable. You might have more luck playing the tight ends like Jordan Akins, OJ Howard, Brevin Jordan. So that would be kind of the first thing. I know in my particular league where I have Brandon Cooks, luckily Van Jefferson just got activated today, and that's a 4 o'clock game. Don't love playing a player coming off injury, especially against a tough defense like the 49ers, but I might consider that an option because the other options I have are Richie James, and I don't love it. I think that's a kind of a really low upside maybe a high floor if he's a slot receiver, but it seems like, with Rondale Robinson back, he may not see as many targets as he did earlier in the season. So I don't love Richie James as an option. I'd rather almost drop him if anything. The other option is Will Dissly. And the tricky thing here is I know in this particular league, I've got Dalton Schultz, and he's questionable. Now I've got Dak as well. I like the stack. If Schultz plays, I will play him. I know it's risky with the knee injury, but I'm going to take that risk. If he doesn't play, though, I want to save Will Dissly to replace him in the tight end spot. Now, if Dalton Schultz plays, I'd be okay, I think, maybe totting out 2 tight ends, even though it's not a tight end premium league. I like the matchup for the Seahawks in terms of, I mentioned earlier, the goal line grade. It's really a high for the Seahawks. Passing wise, that was one of the factors with Noah Fant anyway, choosing Noah Fant over Devontae Parker, for instance. So I'd be okay playing both Schultz and Dissly in that instance. And so maybe makes Dissly sort of the backup option for both. He's not in the lineup right now, but if I need to either replace Schultz or Cooks, it'll be Will Dissly. So Van Jefferson to me becomes the option where if I have to play Dissly as a tight end and I need another player in the flex spot, I will then move Van Jefferson to that flex spot. So it seems like I would say Will Dissly is maybe my best option there. Now I wonder, picking up Marquise Goodwin. I guess the talk is both Tyler Lockett is questionable, and it seems like as much as we thought DK Metcalf wasn't going to play this week, he actually is listed as questionable. So Marquise Goodwin is also a good backup option for Lockett as well, but also a good option for Brandon Cooks. It's funny because I've got Cooks and Lockett in the league, so that's one where if Lockett plays, he's in. If Lockett's out, but Cooks plays, he's in. If both are out, then I'll have to play Marquise Goodwin. And funny enough, in that same league, this is a tricky one. It's the Monday night games, especially at start 1 positions, like tight end. So Hayden Hurst, who is questionable going into Monday night. I know Jamar Chase is also, I think, doubtful. I think he's already been ruled out. So Chase is one where, I don't think anyone expected him to play. It seems like he might even almost be put to the injured reserve. Hayden Hurst, though, intriguing option if he is available, but if he's questionable, but he's questionable, so we don't know if he's available. And so that's one where you might want to play him as a tight end, but because it's tight end and there's only, you've only got, it's a Monday game, you only have the 2 teams to choose from, your options are incredibly limited. So I guess the first thing would be to look at the rest of the Bengals tight ends, and I'm not even sure who that is. So let me look up that real quick, because I believe Drew Sample's injured, unless he's returned from injury. Tight end. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, no, I was correct. Drew Sample is he on injured reserve? Yes. Drew Sample is on injured reserve. So if Hayden Hurst doesn't play, Mitchell Wilcox and Devin Asiasi, former Patriots draft pick, those will be the tight ends for the Bengals. So those would be, again, the first place you always naturally look would be them. The tight end I actually would and I have picked up in case Hurst can't go is Harrison Bryant. And he's the starting tight end for the Browns now that David Njoku's out, and I believe he's also on an injured reserve. So if Harrison Bryant's available, I think he's I think he's a top 20 tight end this week. And if rather than try and guess whether it's going to be Wilcox or Asiasi that's going to be the guy for the Bengals, I think I'd rather just invest in Harrison Bryant and starting tight end for the Browns. So he's a great pivot option. If Hurst can't play, I'd rather Hurst. I'd like that offense better. They're the favored team, and better. We talked about already with Donovan Peoples-Jones how there's a lot of things about the matchup I don't like passing wise, and the poor goal line grade. That all applies to Harrison Bryant as well. So I prefer Hurst, but if Hurst can't go, I think Harrison Bryant is, to me, a better option than with either the 2 backup tight ends for the Bengals. I'd imagine it's Wilcox. It seems like he's been getting on the field more. It's an intriguing offense to go into, but I think, I don't know, I kind of like taking the shot on Harrison Bryant here. So again, if Hurst is out, Harrison Bryant to me becomes that great replacement option. All right, so we've hit 12 noon. I'm going to pull up the active inactive list, and then we will kind of dissect that, and we'll go from there. All right, so the Panthers. Sorry about that. Panthers. We already knew Rashad Higgins was out. They ruled him out earlier. They ruled him out, I think, yesterday or Friday. And Rashad Higgins is also a healthy scratch. He's been there the entire year with the Panthers, and he's been a healthy scratch every single game. It's curious to why they signed him because they haven't used him at all, and it's interesting when you've got guys like Terrace Marshall getting active and Shi Smith who aren't really doing much. It's interesting that Higgins has never been active, but that continues to be the case. For the Falcons, AJ Terrell is out, so I guess that means a better matchup for DJ Moore. So that's intriguing. Anthony Ferkster out. He's been a healthy scratch when they've had all their other tight ends active all year, so not really any surprise there. Yeah, nothing really fantasy relevant for either the Falcons or Panthers, aside from, of course, Hubbard being out, which we knew yesterday. So Dante Foreman, I think, borderline top 20 running back this week. Maybe he should be a top 20 running back. All right, well, here we go. For the Cowboys and Bears, there's only 4 players listed inactive for the Bears. Right tackle Larry Broom, cornerback Lamar Jackson, tight end Jake Tongs, and wide receiver Isaiah Coulter. Tongs and Coulter I don't think are on any rosters, so not really to focus on the line on the Cowboys. Not on the Bears. Focus on the Cowboys. And so for the Cowboys, the big ones are Ezekiel Elliott is out and Noah Brown is out. So Tony Pollard should be in line to see the majority of the work and should have a great game. No Noah Brown means if the Michael Gallup breakout is going to happen, it probably has to be this week. Then maybe they just run so well and effectively that they don't have to pass the ball, but no Noah Brown. And I know I've got, I think, 5 different leagues where he's starting. I'm going to have to go pull him out. I'll just read through like who my backup options are. KJ Osborne, Richie James, Will Dissly, Nyheim Hines, and Robbie Anderson. Oh, another one where I've got Donovan Peoples-Jones. So, I like a few of those options, like KJ Osborne, Nyheim Hines, especially. Will Dissly to a certain extent. That is a tight end premium league, so to flex a tight end, that's fine. But yeah, I think I'm running Will Dissly and Robert Tonyan as the 2 tight ends. Dissly might almost be the better option over Tonyan, to be honest, against that matchup against the Bills. But yeah, those would be players I'm replacing Noah Brown with. I guess Jalen Tolbert will be active today, so maybe that's a good replacement for anyone who also has Noah Brown. Dolphins Lions. For the Dolphins, Myles Gaskin inactive again. He was active, I think, 1 or 2 games this year, and then they haven't really used him much. It's been Mostert, and then they haven't even used Chase Edmonds much. So yeah, not much is changing there. Salvon Ahmed, who is the third guy, even if Gaskin's active, he's not really playable because it seems like whoever's the third guy, whether it's Salvon Ahmed or Myles Gaskin, they don't really get any work. It's mostly going to Mostert. And so River Craycraft and also Eric Ezukama are inactive for the Dolphins as well. It seems like, beside Hill and Waddle, Sherfield's kind of been the third guy, and then Cedric Wilson, who they signed this offseason, really hasn't done much, but is the fourth guy. For the Lions, mostly just defensive players, Mike Hughes, Charles Harris, Michael Brockers. So Dolphins offense should perform well, but there's no fantasy relevant players inactive, which means Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be active today. Those leagues where I was considering Khalif Raymond, I think gonna not now. I think I definitely will stick to whether it was KJ Osborne or Traquan Smith in those cases. But yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown will be active today. And I know earlier in the week TJ Hawkinson was questionable, but I think by the end of the week that he had lost that questionable designation. So Hawkinson's definitely playing. For the Cardinals, they announced this a couple days ago, but James Conner would be inactive. Benjamin gets the start. I consider Keontae Ingram to be playable. I guess Darrell Williams returns because he's not listed here unless he's on the injured reserve. But I think that means Darrell Williams is active. But I do wonder if he is very clearly the third guy. Maybe he eats into that. I'd still play Ingram though in the spots I'm playing him, and I think Benjamin's going to be in a spot where most people will play him. But yeah, I'd even consider Keontae Ingram startable. For the Vikings, no really fantasy relevant players, and they're such a small condensed offense. It's going to be Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, Irv Smith, KJ Osborne, and then the running backs, whether it's Dalvin Cook or Alexander Madison. That's basically about all they throw to. So nice condensed offense. We love those. Raiders and Saints, Darren Waller is inactive again. Some big names on the Saints side as well. Jarvis Landry, Michael Thomas, and Adam Troutman, all inactive. But good news for the Raiders, both Devontae Adams and Hunter Renfrow are active. I guess also Marshawn Lattimore inactive, so should be a good game for Adams. I don't think I'd play Renfro in the spots I'm already playing Renfro. I didn't consider him. I thought he was a strong enough starter. He's going to be in there. And the one league I was talking about, Scott Fishbowl, where I considered him, I think I'm still going to go with Traquan Smith, especially the news with Traquan of Landry and Thomas being out makes him the second wide receiver on the team behind Chris Olave. So I think that's a good spot to be in. So I do like playing Traquan Smith today. And I guess for Darren Waller being out, Foster Moreau would be the starting tight end for the Saints and for the Raiders, against the Saints. And for the Saints, you'd have Juwan Johnson active as well as Taysom Hill. I feel like Taysom Hill's usually probably the better start, even though he's not really running routes, not catching passes, but he's got the touchdown upside and can carry the football. So Patriots now, Kevin Harris inactive. Really has seemed like so Damian Harris will be active today. Didn't really get much work on the Monday night last week. We'll see if a week later it changes much. I still consider Ramondre Stevenson a top 10 option, though, and Damian Harris very clearly the backup. We'll see if that changes today. Okay, now this is weird because I'm seeing the Jets, Flacco and Streveler are both inactive. So who's the backup quarterback behind Zach Wilson? Because I heard Streveler would be active today. Now it seems like he's not active. So that's weird, unless that's a mistake. I thought Streveler would be the backup. Obviously not really playing either, but that's just interesting that it kind of going through that. Corey Davis is officially out. I think they may have announced that a day or two ago. And Zonovan Knight not getting the call up with the Brees Hall injury. Instead, they traded for James Robinson. Robinson will be active. I still think the better play is Michael Carter. That may change down the stretch, but I think for now, Michael Carter is who you want. He's had goal line carries, but I think he's also the one they would trust more than Robinson to run the passing down portion of the offense, be a pass catcher, knowing that timing of the offense. So I'd prefer to play Carter over Robinson this week. But yeah, Brees Hall obviously on injured reserve, and so Corey Davis being inactive. Garrett Wilson's in there. Like I said, Braxton Berrios and Elijah Moore are going to be your main three receivers, I would say, not just wide receivers, because it seems like Zach Wilson's not really throwing to the tight end. Conklin was getting a lot of targets with Flacco early in the season, but that seems to have disappeared. For the Steelers and Eagles, so the Steelers, Chris Boswell is inactive, so not much kicker news, but they're going to have to find another kicker today, whoever their backup kicker is. I wouldn't have loved to play Boswell anyway against the Eagles defense. Like that seems like that's not a kicker you really want, so probably avoid that situation. Not much else, though, in terms of relevance. We know who they're. So Freiermuth did have the concussion earlier in the season. He's back now. Another condensed offense. They're going to throw to Deontay, Claypool, Freiermuth, George Pickens, and whoever the running back is. Like it seems like that's about it. That's their offense. So we love it. I just don't know how much upside this week against the Eagles. For the Eagles, Trey Sermon inactive. So the three main running backs are still going to be Miles Sanders, Kenneth Gainwell, Boston Scott, I think in that order. But yeah, it's basically 10 after 12. So again, I just want to remind everyone to head over to MyBookie and use the double deposit match. The code for that is PRESS22, and they will match your deposit up to $1,000. So you want an extra free $1,000. Sign up for MyBookie and use that double deposit match code, and suddenly you put in $1,000, they will give you an extra $1,000. You'll have $2,000 in your account. So looks like we do have a comment. Oh, just Joel mentioning great show. Thanks, Joel from Hull. Always, we always do a Hull of a show here. At least we try to every morning. But yeah, appreciate Joel for watching. And he usually watches the Ian and Braden as well. So appreciate all the support you're giving to Full Press coverage, Joel. And yeah, 12:10. So I'm going to head out here unless there are any other questions. Like I mentioned, my name is Kyle Senra on Twitter at Senra Says. Hope you enjoyed this, whether it was talking about my own start-sit decisions, but more importantly, why I'm making them and how maybe you can. I find it's helped me to have that process and have that spreadsheet to help visualize the decisions that I'm making in all my leagues. Hope the advice for later injuries as well, whether it's Brandon Cooks, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, or Hayden Hurst, and that's a tricky one, how to navigate those situations for players we don't know if they're going to be active yet, but also updated those inactive players for this morning. I guess the big news is, with the Cowboys, Zeke's out, Noah Brown's out. You've got Amon-Ra St. Brown active. Devontae Adams is active. So there's some good news. Dalton Schultz is active as well. I know he was questionable coming in, but Ryan Tannehill out. So we know a few big names that are out, a few big names that are in. So again, hopefully I was able to help everyone with that. Best of luck with your fantasy football teams today. And like I said, this is Kyle Senra signing out on another episode of Full Press Fantasy Sunday. We'll see you all next week. Bye for now.